Farmer paid a Navajo widow to clean his barn until he saw she was raising 7 kids alone. You hear stories like this out in the territories where the land is hard and the people are harder. This one ain't about heroes, not really. It's about dirt and dust and the kind of desperation that sticks to you like sweat. It starts with a woman. She wasn't old, but the sun had carved lines into her face, deep lines around her eyes and mouth that told of things other than laughter. She stood in the doorway of the Halstead trading post, the light behind her turning her into a dark shape, a silhouette of want. The dust from the road clung to her skirt, a red-brown film that covered everything out here. You could taste it in the air, feel it in your teeth. She had been inside, trying to get credit. Old man Halstead, a man whose heart had shriveled up like a dried apple, had turned her down flat. You could see it in the way she held her shoulders, a rigid line of dignity that was the only thing she had left to bargain with. She had a child with her, a small boy of about 5, who stood so close to her leg he was practically part of her shadow. He didn't make a sound. He just watched everything with big, dark eyes that had seen too much of nothing. His stomach was probably making a whole lot of noise, but his face was a stoic mask. They learned that young. Silence is a shield. The heat was a physical thing, a heavy blanket that smothered the town. Nothing moved. A dog lay in the sliver of shade under the porch, its sides heaving. The silence was thick, broken only by the buzzing of flies around a barrel of salted fish. The woman's pain wasn't loud. It was in that silence, in the way her hand rested on her son's head, a gesture that was both a comfort and an anchor. It was the quiet, grinding pain of a mother who can't feed her child. It's a pain that provokes a kind of rage in you, a deep-seated anger at the injustice of it all. To see a person ground down to nothing, standing there in the dust with her silent, hungry boy, while inside Halstead counted his money. The air was full of the smell of hot leather from the saddles in the shop, and the sharp, metallic tang of the blacksmith's forge down the road, and underneath it all, the smell of poverty, which is a mix of dust and sweat, and the faint, sour smell of hunger. This man Silas saw it all. He wasn't a man given to pity. Pity was a luxury, a soft emotion for people who had the time for it. Silas had only time for work. He was a farmer, a man whose life was measured in seasons and rainfall. He was at the trading post for rock salt and a new handle for his axe. He saw the woman, saw Halstead shake his head from inside, saw the way her shoulders slumped for just a second before she straightened them again. He didn't see a tragedy. He saw a problem, and maybe a solution to one of his own. His barn was a disaster, a generation of junk and filth left by his father, compounded by his own years of neglect. It was a job too big for one man, and he was, for all intents and purposes, one man. He walked out onto the porch, his boots making a heavy, solid sound on the warped wood. He stopped a few feet from her. He didn't look at the boy. He looked at her hands. They were strong hands, calloused and capable. "You need work," he said. It wasn't a question. His voice was rough, like stones grinding together. The woman looked at him. Her eyes were guarded. She didn't nod, didn't speak. She just waited. "My barn," he went on, gesturing vaguely out of town. "Needs mucking out, a week's work, maybe more, pay you in food and coin." The offer hung in the air between them, stark and unadorned. It wasn't an act of charity. It was a business proposition, stripped bare of any kindness. He needed a mess cleaned up. She needed to eat. It was as simple and as brutal as that. The dust swirled around their feet. The boy pressed his face into his mother's skirt. For a long moment, the only sound was the buzzing of the flies. Then she gave a single sharp nod. That was it. No thanks, no questions, just acceptance. An agreement made in the silent language of desperation and necessity. He turned and started walking toward his wagon. "Follow me," he said over his shoulder, and he didn't look back to see if she was. He knew she would be. Now, I want to take a quick second here to talk to you directly. If you're finding yourself pulled into this story, do me a favor and let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. It's always amazing to see how far these stories travel, and if you're enjoying it so far and you want to see how it all unfolds, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. It really does help the channel more than you know, and it makes sure you won't miss what's coming next. All right, let's get back to it. Silas was a man carved from the same hard land he worked. His face was a roadmap of sun and wind, and his hands were blunt instruments, thick and calloused from a lifetime of wrestling a living from the dry soil. He lived alone in a house his grandfather had built, a sturdy, no-nonsense structure of timber and stone that stood against the plains like a stubborn rock. His wife, Mary, had been gone for 10 years, and the silence she'd left behind had become a part of the house, settling into the corners like dust. He wasn't a man for company. He found his rhythm in the solitude, in the predictable cycle of planting and harvesting, of mending fences and tending to the few cattle he kept. People in town thought him strange, a recluse, but he didn't care what they thought. Their world of gossip and small-town politics was a foreign country to him. His world was the fence line, the horizon, the color of the sky. He led the woman and her boy out to his farm, a good 2-mile walk from town. He didn't try to make conversation. The silence between them wasn't awkward. It was just a fact, like the heat. He pointed to the massive barn, its paint peeled away by years of sun and wind, its great doors hanging slightly askew. "This is it," he said. He slid one of the heavy doors open, the wood groaning in protest. The smell that rolled out was thick and suffocating, a mix of old hay, animal manure, rot, and the dry, musty scent of forgotten time. The interior was a cavern of shadows and junk, piles of broken equipment, rotting harnesses, mountains of hardened manure, nests of rats the size of small cats. It was a Herculean task, a monument to neglect. The woman looked at it, her face unreadable. The boy hid behind her again. Silas pointed to a corner where shovels, a pitchfork, and a rusted wheelbarrow stood against the wall. "Tools," he said. "Water pump is behind the house. Well water. Good to drink. Payment when the floor is clean." He didn't elaborate. He didn't soften the order. He stated the terms, the work, the payment. Then he turned and walked back toward his house, leaving her there at the threshold of the filth. He went about his own chores, chopping wood, checking on his cattle, but he was aware of her. He could hear the scrape of a shovel against the hard-packed floor, the rhythmic sound of a person resigned to a long, hard job. He worked on his own, but part of his mind was on the barn. He expected to see her give up. He expected her to come to him and say the job was too much, but the scraping sound was steady, persistent. As the afternoon wore on, a strange thing happened. He was mending a fence on the far side of his property, the side that looked out over the low, rolling hills toward the reservation lands, and he saw them. First one, then another, then more. Children. They came over a rise, moving in a silent, single-file line. They weren't running or playing. They walked with a purpose, like a small, disciplined patrol. There were 6 of them, ranging in age from what looked to be a teenager down to a girl who couldn't be much older than the boy already with the mother. They walked right up to the barn, and without a word they joined their mother. He watched from a distance, leaning on his fence post, the hammer forgotten in his hand. He saw the oldest, a tall, lanky boy, take a shovel and start working alongside his mother. 2 of the younger girls began gathering smaller pieces of junk, making neat piles. Another girl took the smallest children, including the boy who had been in town, and sat them in a patch of shade, keeping them quiet and out of the way. They were a team, a silent, efficient unit that moved with an unspoken understanding. They didn't need to be told what to do. They saw the work, and they did it. And that's when it hit him. Not like a bolt of lightning, but like a slow, dawning realization. This wasn't just a widow he'd hired. This was a woman raising 7 children, alone, in this God-forsaken dust bowl. The sheer logistical impossibility of it staggered him. Feeding them, clothing them, keeping them safe. It wasn't a matter of emotion for him, not pity or sympathy. It was a cold, hard calculation of survival, and the numbers didn't add up. Yet here they were, working. He watched them for a long time, this small tribe, battling the mountain of filth in his barn. A deep, grudging respect began to form in his gut. It was a respect for their resilience, for their quiet, stubborn refusal to be broken. He didn't know her name. He didn't know their story, but he saw their strength, and it was a thing to be reckoned with. He finally straightened up, picked up his hammer, and walked back to the house. The image of the 7 children working in the dying light burned into his mind. The scrape of the shovels followed him all the way. The sun bled out of the sky, leaving behind a bruise of purple and orange on the horizon. The sounds from the barn slowed, then stopped. A deep twilight settled over the farm, and with it, a chill that hinted at the coldness of the high desert night. Silas sat on his porch, watching the dark shape of the barn. He knew they were still there. He could imagine them, huddled together, exhausted and dirty, preparing to sleep on the hard ground or in a corner of the filthy barn. A cold night on an empty stomach was a miserable thing. He'd known a few in his life. He sat there for a long time, the silence of his house pressing in on him. Finally, he stood up, the legs of his chair scraping against the porch floor. He went inside and lit a lantern. Then he went to his pantry. He didn't have much, but he had staples: a big sack of pinto beans, a bag of flour, smoked bacon. He filled a large pot with water, dumped in a generous amount of beans and set it on the stove. While it cooked, he mixed up a batch of dough for skillet bread. It was all practical, mechanical motion, the kind of work that kept a man from thinking too much. When the beans were soft and the bread was cooked, he ladled a huge portion of the thick, savory stew into a cast-iron pot and wrapped the bread in a clean cloth. He carried the pot and the bread, along with the lantern, out toward the barn. As he got closer, he could see them. They had cleared a small area just inside the doors and were huddled together for warmth, the children wrapped in thin, worn blankets. The mother sat watch, her back straight, a sentinel guarding her flock. She looked up as he approached, her face illuminated by the flickering lantern light. She wasn't afraid, just wary. He stopped a few feet away, not wanting to crowd them. "Ain't sleeping out here," he said, his voice a low rumble. He jerked his head toward a small, weathered building a little ways off. "Bunkhouse. Ain't much, but it's got a roof and bunks. Better than the ground." He set the pot of beans and the bread down on the ground between them. "Food," he stated, as if it were an obvious fact. He saw one of the younger girls, her face streaked with grime, nursing a long, shallow cut on her forearm. It was red and angry-looking. He turned without a word and went back to the house. He returned a minute later with a small tin of pine tar salve his mother used to make, good for cuts and scrapes on man or beast, and a strip of clean cotton torn from an old shirt. He didn't approach the girl. He didn't offer to tend the wound himself. That would have been a trespass. He simply placed the tin and the cloth on the ground next to the pot of food, an offering, a tool for her to use. The woman, the mother, looked at the pot, then at the bunkhouse, then at the salve. She gave him a long, searching look. He just stood there, holding the lantern, his face half in shadow. Finally, she gave another one of those single, sharp nods. It was all the thanks he needed or expected. He turned and walked back to his porch, leaving the lantern with them. He sat back down in his chair and watched as she led her children to the pot. She served them first, making sure each one had their fill before she took any for herself. Then she took the salve and the cloth and gently, methodically, cleaned and dressed her daughter's wound. The light from the lantern cast a warm, golden glow on the small scene. It was a ritual of survival, of a mother's care as old as time itself. He was providing shelter, food, medicine. She was providing the care, the order, the leadership. A silent partnership was being forged, not with words or sentiment, but with the blunt, necessary actions required to get through another day. He sat there until their light went out in the bunkhouse, the weight of his own solitude feeling a little less heavy than it had before. The days fell into a rhythm. Sunup to sundown, the sounds of work echoed from the barn. The scraping of shovels, the creak of the wheelbarrow, the low murmur of the mother giving instructions to her children in her own tongue. Silas went about his own work, but the farm no longer felt empty. It was populated by this quiet, industrious family. The mountain of filth in the barn was shrinking, revealing the clean stone floor beneath. Every evening he would cook a large meal, stew, beans, roasted potatoes, and leave it for them by the bunkhouse door. They never spoke of the arrangement. It just was. One evening the air was still and cool. The sky was clear, littered with stars so bright they looked like holes punched in a black ceiling. Silas was on his porch, cleaning a rifle, the smell of oil and solvent sharp in the air. The woman was sitting on the steps of the bunkhouse, mending one of her children's shirts by the light of the lantern he'd left them. The space between them, a good 50 yards of packed earth, felt less like a divide and more like a shared silence. He finished with the rifle, setting the pieces on a cloth. He stared out at the dark line of the horizon. "My wife, Mary," he said, his voice quiet but carrying in the still air. He wasn't really talking to the woman. He was talking to the night, to the ghosts that lived in the silence. "She's buried up on that hill, under the big cottonwood." The woman stopped her sewing. She didn't look at him, but he knew she was listening. "Fever took her," he continued, his voice flat, recounting facts. "Came on fast, burned her up in 3 days. By the time I could have gotten a doctor from town, it was already too late. This house got real quiet after that. Sometimes the silence is so loud it's like a ringing in your ears." He stopped. He hadn't spoken of Mary to another soul in years. The words felt strange in his mouth, like stones he'd been carrying for a long time. A long moment passed. The only sound was the chirping of crickets. Then she spoke. Her voice was low and soft, her English careful, deliberate. "My husband was a hunter," she said, looking down at the shirt in her lap. "He was a good man, strong. He taught my oldest son to track. He went out one morning to hunt deer. He did not come back." She paused, and Silas could feel the weight of that simple statement. "Some men from the fort came. They said there was a fight. They said he was gone. They moved us to the reservation. Sickness came. 2 of my babies, they are buried there." She gestured eastward, toward the dark, unseen lands. "Then the soldiers came again. They said our land was not our land anymore. They burned our hogan. We had nowhere. So we walked." It wasn't a plea for sympathy. It was a testimony, a direct, unvarnished recounting of loss after loss. She told it in plain, simple language, the way you'd describe a long, hard journey. A litany of wounds. His wife buried on the hill. Her husband lost to violence. His empty house, her burned home, his 2 buried children, her 2 buried babies. They were ghosts, haunting the space between them. He didn't say, "I'm sorry." She didn't say, "I understand." There was no need. The shared landscape of their pain was laid bare in the cool night air. They were 2 survivors from 2 different worlds, who had both learned the hard lesson that the world could take everything from you in the blink of an eye. The silence that fell after her words was different. It wasn't empty anymore. It was filled with a rough, hard-won understanding. 2 solitudes touching in the dark. The work on the barn was almost done. A kind of fragile peace had settled over the farm. But the land was never peaceful for long. It was always testing you, always throwing something new at you. The first sign of trouble was the sky. It started as a faint yellowish haze on the western horizon late one afternoon. Silas saw it and stopped what he was doing. He'd seen skies like that before. "Dust storm," he muttered to himself. He strode toward the barn, his pace quick. The woman and her children were sweeping the last of the debris out the main doors. "Storm's coming," he said, his voice sharp with urgency. "A bad one. We need to get the cattle in." She looked at the sky, then at him, and nodded once. There was no panic in her eyes, only a deep, ingrained understanding of nature's violence. She spoke quickly to her children in Navajo. Instantly, they became a flurry of motion. The older boy, Ashki, ran with Silas toward the pasture. The woman directed the younger children to start securing anything loose around the yard. Tools, buckets, pieces of timber. The wind was picking up now, a low moan that was quickly growing into a howl. It whipped dust into their eyes, stinging their skin. The air grew thick and choked with red dirt. The sky was turning a terrifying bruised orange. It was like the world was ending. "Head him to the corral," Silas yelled to Ashki over the rising shriek of the wind. The boy was a natural with the animals. He moved with a calm confidence, flanking the small herd, guiding the nervous cattle toward the gate. He didn't need to be told twice. He knew what to do. Back at the farmstead, the woman and her daughters were wrestling with the heavy barn doors, trying to force them shut against the gale. Silas ran to help, putting his shoulder to the wood. Together they managed to slide the heavy bar into place just as the first real blast of the storm hit, a solid wall of wind and sand that felt like it could tear the buildings from their foundations. "The house!" Silas roared. "Everyone to the house." He herded them all, the woman, her 7 children, across the yard as debris started to fly through the air. They stumbled into his kitchen, gasping for breath, just as the world outside disappeared into a churning, opaque cloud of red dust. They were all crammed inside his home. His quiet, solitary fortress had been breached. The storm raged outside, a physical assault on the house. The windows rattled, the walls groaned. The sound was deafening. Inside, there was a strange calm. The children huddled together, their eyes wide but silent. The woman stood by the door, as if to guard it from the storm's fury. Silas stood by the window, watching the apocalypse unfold. They were trapped, thrown together not by choice but by the raw, indiscriminate power of the land. In that moment, they weren't a farmer and his hired help. They were a small band of humans pitted against a force of nature. A team. A raw, desperate survivalist unit, breathing the same dusty air, listening to the same howling wind, bound together in the fragile shelter of the old stone house. The storm howled for hours, a relentless, sanding scream that scraped at the nerves. When it finally passed, it left behind a world remade in silence and devastation. A thick blanket of red dust covered everything, softening the edges of the world, muffling all sound. The morning sun rose on a scene of quiet chaos. Fences were down, a section of the corral was flattened, and debris was scattered across the yard like a giant's discarded toys. Silas stepped out onto his porch, surveying the damage. It was a week's worth of work, at least. He felt a familiar weariness settle in his bones. This land, it always took its pound of flesh. He turned to go get his tools, but he stopped. The woman and her children were already emerging from the bunkhouse. They didn't wait for instructions. They didn't ask what needed to be done. They simply started to work. The woman and the older girls began clearing debris, their movements efficient and practiced. They gathered fallen branches and broken boards, stacking them in a neat pile. The two oldest boys, Ashkey and the one next to him, picked up the post-hole digger and a sledgehammer and looked at Silas, waiting for him to point the way. A flicker of something, gratitude maybe, or just plain relief, went through him. He gave a curt nod toward the broken fence line, and the boys set off. He worked alongside them, his big frame moving with the steady power of a draft horse. They didn't talk much. The work was the conversation. The thud of the sledgehammer driving posts, the scrape of shovels, the grunts of effort. They were a single organism, repairing their shared territory. Late in the afternoon, they found the calf. It had been driven by the storm into a deep, muddy washout created by the flash flood that must have accompanied the dust. It was stuck fast, up to its belly in thick, sucking mud, bellowing in terror. Silas slid down the muddy bank without a second thought. The mud was worse than he thought. A cold, greasy slurry that gripped his boots and tried to pull him down. He pushed against the calf's rump, his muscles straining, but it wouldn't budge. He was sinking himself. "Damn it," he grunted, wiping a sleeve across his mud-caked face. He was stuck. He looked up and saw the woman standing on the bank, watching him. Her face was calm, assessing the situation. She turned and said something to Ashkey. The boy disappeared toward the barn and returned a moment later with a long, thick rope. She took the rope and, with her son, scrambled down the bank on the opposite side of the wash from Silas. She was surprisingly agile, her worn moccasins finding purchase where his heavy boots had slipped. They worked their way around the frightened calf. She spoke to it in low, soothing tones in Navajo. The animal's frantic struggles seemed to lessen. With a deft movement, she and Ashkey managed to loop the rope around the calf's chest, just behind its front legs. She tossed the end of the rope to Silas. "Pull," she said. It was a simple command. It was the first time she had told him what to do. He grabbed the rope. On the other side, she and her son dug their heels in. "Now!" she called out. They all pulled at once. Silas, the woman, her son. 3 bodies straining in unison. The air was filled with the sound of their ragged breaths, the squelch of the mud and the frightened cries of the calf. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a great sucking sound, the calf lurched forward. They scrambled for footing, pulling together, gaining ground inch by inch. Finally, the calf was free, scrambling up the bank and running back toward its mother. The 3 of them were left in the wash, covered from head to toe in mud, breathing hard. Silas looked at her. Her face was splattered with mud, her hair coming loose from its tight bun. She looked back at him, a flicker of something in her dark eyes. It wasn't triumph. It was a shared understanding. They had saved something together. It wasn't just his calf anymore. It was part of this place they were all fighting to hold together. The bond between them had deepened, forged not in words, but in mud and sweat, and the shared physical struggle for survival. He was stone, she was fire, and together they were making a life on this hard piece of earth. After a week of back-breaking labor, the farm was mostly put back together. The fences were mended, the debris was cleared, the barn stood clean and empty, but they were running low on supplies. The storm had depleted their reserves faster than expected. Silas knew he had to go to town. He decided to take the oldest boy, Ashki, with him. The boy was strong, and he'd need help loading the wagon. The trip to town was quiet. Ashki sat beside him on the wagon seat, straight-backed and silent, taking in the landscape with watchful eyes. When they pulled up to the Halstead trading post, a few of the town loafers were sitting on the porch, spitting tobacco juice into the dust. They stopped talking when they saw Silas pull up with the Navajo boy. Their eyes lingered on Ashki, full of a lazy, mean-spirited curiosity. Silas ignored them, swinging himself down from the wagon. "Get the flour and the salt," he told Ashki, handing him a list. "I'll get the rest." Inside, the store was dim and smelled of coffee beans and leather. Henderson, the storekeeper, a man with a fleshy face and small, suspicious eyes, leaned on the counter. "Silas," he said, his voice a little too friendly. "Good to see you. Heard you had quite a blow out your way." "We managed," Silas said, his voice flat. He wasn't here for small talk. "Need 50 pounds of potatoes, 10 pounds of bacon, and a sack of coffee." Henderson started gathering the items, his movements slow. "Heard you got some help out at your place," he said, not looking at Silas. "Some natives." He let the word hang in the air, waited with insinuation. Silas didn't reply. He just waited, his presence filling the small space. At that moment, Ashki came in carrying a heavy sack of flour over his shoulder with an ease that belied his lean frame. He set it down by the door and went back for the salt. Henderson watched him, a smirk playing on his lips. One of the loafers from the porch, a man named Cobb with a stained beard and a cruel mouth, stepped inside. "Well, well, Silas," Cobb said, his voice loud and carrying. "Didn't take you for the type to be hiring savages. You watch your pockets around that one?" Silas's jaw tightened. He could feel a cold, slow anger beginning to burn in his gut. Ashki came back in with the sack of salt, his face a perfect, unreadable mask. He pretended not to hear. "What's a man like you need with a squaw and her whole litter anyway?" Cobb sneered, spitting a stream of brown juice that landed dangerously close to Ashki's feet. That was it. Silas didn't say a word. He didn't raise his voice. He simply turned his head and looked at Cobb. He fixed him with a stare so cold and so full of quiet violence that Cobb's smirk faltered. The air in the store went still and heavy. Henderson stopped what he was doing. Silas held the stare for a long, uncomfortable moment, letting the weight of his silence do the work. Then, without breaking eye contact with Cobb, he spoke to the boy. "Ashki," he said, his voice a low growl. "Take the flour to the wagon." Ashki, understanding the command was about more than just flour, hoisted the sack and walked out, his head held high. Silas turned his attention back to Henderson. He laid his coins on the counter, the metal clinking loudly in the tense quiet. He gathered his supplies without another word, his movements deliberate and powerful. He had built a wall of ice around himself and the boy, and the townsmen were on the other side of it. He walked out of the store, leaving Cobb and Henderson in a thick, stunned silence. It wasn't a grand speech. It was a blunt, powerful shutdown, an act of quiet defiance that was more intimidating than any threat. Outside, he saw Ashki standing by the wagon. The boy looked at him, and for the first time, Silas saw something other than stoicism in his eyes. It was a flicker of understanding. He had been defended. And in that moment, the bond between the old farmer and the young boy became something solid, something real. The confrontation in town had stirred up a hornet's nest. Silas knew it. Men like Cobb didn't take well to being put in their place, especially not in front of others. Trouble was coming. He could feel it in the air, a tension that had nothing to do with the weather. It came a few days later, in the late afternoon. A wagon rattled up the lane. It wasn't a neighbor. It was Henderson, the storekeeper, and Cobb, and another man Silas didn't recognize. They weren't here for a friendly visit. They pulled up in the yard and got out, their movements slow and arrogant. "Silas," Henderson called out, trying to sound official. "We're here on behalf of the town, got a report of some stolen livestock. Figured we'd start by checking your place." It was a lie, and they all knew it. A flimsy excuse to intrude, to intimidate. The woman and her children, who had been weeding a small patch of ground near the house, froze. The younger children scurried behind their mother, who stood her ground, her face a stone mask. Cobb's eyes roamed over her, a greasy, leering look on his face. "You speak English, girl?" he asked, his voice dripping with condescension. "A pretty thing like you shouldn't be out here in the dirt with the animals." Silas had been on his porch, methodically cleaning his hunting rifle. It was a ritual he performed every week, a habit ingrained from years of solitude. He hadn't said a word, just watched them arrive. He had a code, a vow of non-involvement he'd lived by for a decade. He didn't meddle in town business, and he didn't want their business on his land. But they had brought it here. They had crossed his fence line. They were threatening the quiet, fragile peace he had allowed to grow here. He slowly, deliberately, began to reassemble the rifle. The click of the bolt sliding into place was unnervingly loud in the tense silence. Then the sharp clack, as he seated the magazine. It wasn't a threat of action. It was the sound of preparation. He stood up, the rifle held loosely in one hand, pointed at the ground. He didn't raise it. He didn't have to. His body was rigid with a contained fury. He walked to the edge of the porch, his boots making heavy, solid thuds on the wood. He stopped and looked at the three men. "This is my land," he said. His voice wasn't loud. It was a low, dangerous growl that seemed to come from the earth itself. The jovial, menacing facade of the townsman began to crack. "They," he said, with a slight nod toward the woman and her children, "are my business." The words were a declaration, a line drawn in the dust. He was no longer just their employer. He was their protector. He had publicly claimed them. "Get off my land," he said. The words were final, an order, not a request. Henderson licked his lips nervously, but Cobb, full of cheap whiskey and self-importance, scoffed. "Now hold on, Silas, you can't just—" He took a step forward. Silas didn't move a muscle. He just stood there, a mountain of quiet rage. The violence was not in the rifle in his hand, it was in his stillness. It was in the promise in his eyes. He had crossed a line in his own soul. The man who wanted nothing to do with anyone was now standing ready to do violence for these people he barely knew. Cobb saw it. He saw the truth in Silas's eyes, and he stopped cold. The bravado drained out of him, leaving behind a petty, fearful man. He took a step back. Henderson, seeing his chance, started backing toward the wagon. "No trouble here, Silas. Just doing our due diligence." They scrambled back into their wagon, fumbling with the reins. They turned it around and rattled away, leaving a cloud of dust and muttered threats behind them. Silas stood on the porch until they were out of sight. The rifle felt heavy in his hand. He had broken his own code. He had stepped out of his solitude and into the messy world of other people. He turned and looked at the woman. She was still standing there, her children clustered around her. Her face was unreadable, but her eyes held his for a long moment. The unspoken contract between them had been irrevocably changed. It was no longer about a clean barn or a wage paid in food. It was about sanctuary. The dust from the townsmen's wagon settled. The silence they left behind was different, heavier, charged with the residue of the confrontation. The unspoken arrangement of work for shelter had been shattered, and in its place was a new reality they hadn't yet named. That evening, the air was cool and still. Silas sat on his porch steps, not in his usual chair. It was a small change, but it felt significant. He stared out at the land, the rifle now cleaned and put away, but the feel of it was still in his hands. He heard a soft footstep on the packed earth and looked up. It was the woman. She didn't approach the porch but stood a few yards away, a silhouette against the fading light. "They will come back," she said. Her voice was a quiet statement of fact, not of fear. He nodded slowly, his eyes on the horizon. "I reckon." A long silence stretched between them, filled with the chirping of crickets. The pretense was gone. The simple transaction was over. He had defended her. He had named her his business. He had tied his fate to hers. She took a tentative step closer. "When we were walking," she began, her voice barely a whisper, "I would tell my children stories, to make them forget the hunger, to make them forget the fear." She paused as if gathering the strength to say the next words. "I was afraid of you," she confessed, her gaze fixed on the ground. "When you offered work. I have seen men like you, men with hard faces. Sometimes they are the cruelest. I thought you would use us and then turn us out when the work was done. Or worse." She looked up at him then, her eyes dark pools of memory and pain. "Those men today, they are the world I have always known. A world that takes and hurts and pushes us from our homes. They look at us and see animals. They do not see people." Her words were simple, unadorned, but they carried the weight of a lifetime of injustice. It was a confession more profound than the story of her husband's death. It was the story of her soul. Silas listened, his heart, a thing he thought had turned to stone, feeling a dull, heavy ache. He had no words to offer. What could he say to a pain that vast? After another long silence, she straightened her shoulders, a gesture of profound dignity. She took another step forward, closing the distance between them until she stood at the foot of the porch steps. "My name," she said, her voice clear and steady, "is Yilyani." She said it slowly, carefully, as if offering him a precious, fragile gift. "It means new beginning." The name settled in the air between them, a thing of power and significance. She had given him her true self, not the label of woman or native that the world had branded her with. Then she turned slightly and gestured to the oldest boy, who stood watching from the bunkhouse door. "That is Ashki. It means boy." She pointed to the next. A quiet girl. Hosh. Cactus. One by one she named them. Deeb, sheep. Nashdoi, wildcat. Tsela, star. Atsa, eagle. And the smallest one, the one who had stood by her in town, she called Neol, wind. They were no longer a silent, anonymous cluster of children. They were Ashki, and Hosh, and Daib, and Nashdoi, and Sela, and Atsa, and Neol. They were individuals, with names that tied them to the world, to the land. Yilyani had trusted him with their names. It was an act of supreme vulnerability, a laying down of the final shield. In the growing dark of the quiet farm, it felt like the first light of dawn. The next morning broke clear and bright. The air was washed clean, and the world felt new. The barn was clean, the fences were mended. The work, as originally agreed upon, was done. An unspoken question hung in the morning air, as tangible as the scent of dust and sage. What now? The contract was fulfilled. Yilyani and her 7 children could take the coin Silas owed them and leave, or he could tell them to go. The thought left a hollow feeling in his chest. Silas came out of his house after his morning coffee. He didn't walk toward the bunkhouse to settle the payment. He didn't go to the barn. Instead, he walked to a fallow patch of ground beside the house. It had been Mary's garden. For 10 years, it had been a tangle of weeds and stubborn, wild grasses, a monument to his grief. He knelt down, his old knees protesting, and began to pull the weeds. He worked methodically, his big hands yanking the thorny intruders from the dry soil, tossing them into a pile. He wasn't just clearing a patch of land, he was clearing a space in his life. Yilyani and the children came out of the bunkhouse. They stood for a moment watching him. Ashki, Hosh, Daibe, all of them. They saw the old man on his knees tending a dead garden. Then, without a word being exchanged, Yilyani walked over. She knelt a few feet away from him and began to pull weeds. Her movements were graceful and efficient. A moment later, Ashki and Hosh joined her. Then the other children, even little Neol, came and began to work, their small hands pulling at the smaller weeds, imitating their mother. They worked together in the morning sun, a silent team. The only sounds were the rustle of the weeds being pulled, the soft thud as they were tossed on the pile, and the quiet breathing of people at work. They cleared the entire patch in less than an hour. The dark, rich soil, neglected for a decade, was exposed to the sun again. Silas stood up, brushing the dirt from his knees. He looked at the cleared ground, then at Yilyani and her children, their faces smudged with dirt. He felt a crack in the stone wall around his heart. He turned and went into his shed. He came back a moment later holding a small, tightly tied cloth bag. It was faded and worn. He walked over to Yilyani and held it out. "Mary's," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name. She took the bag and untied the string. Inside were seeds. dried kernels of corn, mottled beans, the pale, flat seeds of squash. They were old, but they had been kept safe and dry. They were the seeds of a life that had ended, now being offered to a life that was just beginning. Yilyani looked from the seeds in her hand to Silas's weathered face. He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. She took a handful of the seeds. She knelt again, and with her finger she poked a shallow hole in the waiting earth. She dropped a single corn kernel in. She spoke softly to her children in Navajo, her voice a low murmur, teaching them. They gathered around, their dark heads bent together, and they began to plant. Silas watched them, this family he had brought to his farm, as they put seeds into the soil that had held so much of his past. They were putting down roots. It wasn't a promise of forever. It wasn't a declaration of love or family. It was something more real. It was the shared, hopeful act of planting. It was a belief in a future harvest, a quiet faith that something new could grow in the old, scarred ground. A seed of belonging, sown together in the dust. If you enjoyed this story, please give this video a like and hit that subscribe button for more content just like this. We'll see you in the next one.